prayer concern that didn't make it to me right away. We joined Corey and Kelly Cornelli in praying for Adam Gertz. He's the son of a friend and he has a brain tumor. We pray that it is something that is fixable. We pray for healing. We pray for hope. And I don't know if anybody missed Caden shaking their hand. But I love it when our children show us how to be people of Christ and just make sure that they touch all of our lives, literally and figuratively. That boy's going to grow up to be a pastor. Well, there is an old saying that hindsight is 20/20, which means we look back and see things we wished we had noticed while we were in the moment. We wish, perhaps, that we had thought of a retort or a reply that was made to us as a statement or an insult. Or maybe we look back and wish that we had been smart enough not to make the mistake that we had made. Maybe we wish that we had recognized what we lost before we actually lost it. Or on Monday mornings, we look back and wish the coach had called a different play. Or that the player had not been so easy to tag out, or so easy to tackle. Hindsight. Well, two of Jesus' followers were walking home from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And one was Cleopas, whose mother had stood with the two Marys at the foot of the cross. The other remains unnamed and unknown. But the two had heard the story of the empty tomb. But, given Emmaus was 7 miles away from Jerusalem, they had started walking as soon as the sun came up. They'd not seen any of the appearances of the risen Christ. As they walked, they did exactly what we all do when something noteworthy takes place around town. They talked about the crucifixion and about their sorrow over Jesus' death. They said that they had hoped that Jesus would be the Messiah, the one who would drive Rome out of Israel. But now that dream was gone, and they were walking with a sense of profound hopelessness and despair. Jesus approached the two and began walking with them. Now, joining people as they walked along the roads in first century Israel was pretty commonplace. Highway robbery and attacks were all too frequent in a town or in a nation that was overwhelmed with poverty. So when people encountered others walking, they usually joined them. There was safety in numbers. And when asked what they were talking about, the two relayed the story of the crucifixion along with their dashed dreams and their dashed hopes. They mentioned that the women from their group had reported the empty tomb and the angel's words about Jesus' resurrection, but to date, none of the men had seen Jesus raised from death, so they had their doubts. I keep wanting to make a joke about mansplaining, but I can't work it in. Jesus immediately began explaining the resurrection, beginning with the law of Moses, up through the prophets, up to the events of the weekend. And as was the custom in Middle Eastern hospitality, the two invited Jesus to spend the evening with them. Now, I suspect they wanted Jesus to stay with them for more reasons than mere hospitality. Jesus was helping them understand and make sense of the death and resurrection of their Messiah. And for the first time, I suspect, they were starting to feel a twinge of hope. They began to think maybe the women were correct. Maybe Jesus had been raised from death to life. When they got to the place they were staying, Jesus must have been the oldest man at the table, for he took the bread, he blessed it, and he broke it. And as soon as the bread was broken, the two recognized Jesus as the one that they had followed. They recognized Jesus through the blessing and the breaking of bread because they were probably one of the many who were with him at that last Passover feast, what we call the Last Supper. And in that moment of the blessing and the breaking of the bread, they knew that Jesus had been raised to life. They knew that the tomb was empty. They knew Jesus was alive. And as they walked back to Jerusalem, filled with more energy than they had had walking to Emmaus, hindsight kicked in. And the more they talked, the more the two recognized and felt things that they hadn't previously recognized. They said that their hearts burned within them as that mystery man had talked. They knew they had heard that kind of teaching before, and the more they talked about it, the more hindsight kicked in, and the more they wished they had recognized the signals that their bodies were giving them and recognized Jesus right away. Hindsight is an amazing tool for recognizing all the ways and all the times we have experienced God's presence in our lives. Hindsight gives us wonderful clues as to all the times that we have recognized Jesus in our lives in the past. But the problem with hindsight is in the past. And we can find some comfort in that, but I suspect many of us would wish that we could recognize God's presence in our lives right in the moment, rather than having to recognize God through hindsight. Because if we had been able to see God's presence in the moment, we might have been able to save ourselves a world of hurt, and a world of pain, a world of sorrow, and a universe full of worry. If we had recognized God's presence as we were going through the event, we might have been more optimistic, and it might have been easier to live inside of our own heads. The good news is, hindsight is a powerful tool that can help us learn how to recognize God's presence in the moment. We can learn from those past experiences how to see God in the moment that we need to see God. In those moments when we are up to our necks in alligators and can't figure out a way to drain the swamp. We can use hindsight to see God in situations in the past, most often by remembering what was happening in our bodies. The two in the Gospels said that their hearts were warmed as they listened to that mystery person teach them the Scriptures. As we think back to those moments in the past where through hindsight we can see God was present, we can begin to learn how our bodies react when we recognize God in the moment. For instance, sometimes while we're living through stress, our stomachs clench up and we have no appetite. Then somewhere along there, our stomachs relax and we begin to get hungry again. We can think back to that moment when we began to relax and get hungry and ask ourselves what happened that we knew God was present. Does that make sense? I need a response. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Because I'd keep going otherwise. For me, I truly get a pain in the neck when I'm tense or worried, right there. And I've learned that in that moment when everything starts to relax and the pain starts to ease, it's not just going to the chiropractor because that doesn't do it. But when the pain starts to ease, I can look and say, oh God, oh, you're there, thank you. Or in those moments when we feel that tightness in our jaws and the headaches start to relax. Or that moment when we begin to yawn because we're starting to breathe more deeply again. That moment when we get goosebumps or tingles. That moment when tears come to our eyes and we begin to weep. Those are the moments in the midst of it all when we can look back and say, oh, that's when I could feel God's presence. Oh. Because as we think about those times in the past, when we can identify God's presence, we can start to pay attention to how our bodies react now. For instance, when that pain literally in my neck starts to throb, I start to pay attention to when it begins to relax. Because that's the moment I know that I'm turning to God rather than to myself for help. That's the moment when I can say, okay, God, I can let you in and stop trying to do it all myself. In those moments when we realize that that part of our bodies that has not been working right begins to relax and cooperate, we can say, oh God, oh, I finally relaxed. I finally let you come into my life. As we practice hindsight, we can develop a level of confidence about God being present and at work in our lives right now. But practicing hindsight is just that. It takes practice. We have to be willing to go back into that moment, to remember that moment when we felt awful, when life was so terribly hard, when we didn't know how we were going to drain the swamp, and to remember that moment when we experienced the presence of God. What part of our bodies began to give us that clue that we could trust God to be there? Because as we learn how our bodies react, we can begin to experience God in the moment. And the more we practice hindsight, the more we can understand that God is actively at work in our lives, offering courage, resilience, persistence, grace, forgiveness, and second chances. And the more convinced we become that God is offering those same things right here and right now in the present. The more we practice hindsight, the more we begin to notice God at work right now. Noticing God means feeling hopeful when the situation appears to be desperate. Noticing God means learning to trust that the outcome will be okay. It might not be what we want it to be, but ultimately it will be okay. Noticing God means we learn that we don't have to worry so much. Anybody else making worry an Olympic sport? Yeah. When we stop and notice God, we begin to realize we don't have to worry so much. God is here. All is well because God is here. Noticing God means feeling an assurance and a confidence about life, and about who we are in life, and about how we're acting in life that we wouldn't have without it. The two followers in Emmaus experienced hindsight, and my hope is that they continue to practice hindsight until their faith in God's presence became overwhelmingly strong, until they could notice the presence of the risen Christ in their lives all the time. I hope and pray we all either begin or continue to practice hindsight, because the more we recognize Jesus' presence in our lives in the past, the more we'll be able to recognize Jesus' presence in the moment. And as we notice Jesus, the risen Christ, in the everyday moments of our lives, we'll discover we truly are filled with the peace that passes understanding. That we truly experience the joy that comes from walking with God. And yes, our lives might not always be happy, but in the midst of it all, we'll know that peace and joy that comes from walking with Jesus in the moment. Amen. Amen.